Welcome to the Explore God online Q&A forum. I'm Bridget Henderson, your host this evening. Our topic of discussion tonight, can we know God personally? We'd love for you to get in on the discussion by tweeting your questions to hashtag ExploreGodQA. That's hashtag ExploreGodQA. And I'm joined tonight by Austin pastors John Burke and Eric Bryant and special guest Jennifer Fulwiler, who converted from atheism to Christianity and now blogs about that experience at conversiondiary.com. Thanks for joining us. Jennifer, I want to get to your personal story in just a minute, but first let me ask all of you this idea of knowing God personally. It's a question that virtually every human considers at some point in their life. Is there a God, and can he be known? And whether you land on belief or unbelief, it seems like a pretty important question that we should all be asking, right? I mean, the implications are pretty significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you believe really does determine how you live your life and how you treat other people. And so certainly wrestling through, is there a God and can I know him and what is he like and what does he want me to be like is crucial, just as you said.
Well, prominent atheist Richard Dawkins says that the idea of a personal God is delusional. But a Pew poll shows that 92% of Americans believe in a God, and 60% of those believe in a personal relationship with God. So are all of those people, is it possible they're delusional and have imagined this relationship with God, John?
Well, I mean, I guess that's possible. I personally think another way to frame the question is, what's more delusional? You know, is it more delusional to live your life as if you have purpose and meaning and love really matters and, you know, you can actually contribute something of substance in life by what you're doing because you believe there is a God and life does matter? Or is it more delusional to live that way, which most all of us do, including atheists, but knowing in your heart that that's not true at all? So that, to me, feels way more delusional if we're going to compare, but I'm just one person.
Well, you know, the idea, though, of knowing the creator of the universe, that is a difficult proposition for a lot of people to fathom. I mean, it's one thing to believe in a higher power, another thing to believe in this interventionist God that cares deeply for humanity.
Yeah.
I mean, you could see why a lot of people struggle with that concept.
Yeah, I think that, I was definitely raised to seek truth above all things with everything. It was, is it true? Is it true? Is it true? And so when you take that very, objective truth-oriented nature, and you see this a lot in atheist communities, then I think it becomes hard to trust the idea of a relationship because you think, what if I think I'm having a relationship with God, but it's all in my head? You get used to this idea of, I believe that this table is here because I can touch it, I can feel it. But what if we atheists were very distrustful of things that could not be measured, that could not be observed with the five senses. And to something you say earlier, I always think it's funny when I hear Richard Dawkins and P.Z. Myers and the other big atheists talking about that because, like you said, I mean, the studies show that the vast majority of people alive today, and presumably who have ever lived, seek that sort of relationship with God and believe that it's real. So I guess what he's saying is the default state of being human is to be delusional. I mean, that's kind of weird when you think about it. So, but yeah, I think it's just that lack of being able to measure it and prove it objectively is what trips people up.
Is the idea, though, that God is personal, is that an overinflated view of our importance and our significance? I mean, in the Middle Ages, we thought the earth was the center of everything, but we now know we're this, relatively small planet in a relatively small universe among hundreds of billions, or in a relatively small galaxy among hundreds of billions of galaxies. And as small as we are, we're supposed to think that God cares personally about each and every one of us.
Yeah, I mean, Bridget, I think if that's the only data you're looking at, then absolutely. We are delusional to think we matter at all if all we are is just a speck of biological matter, stardust in
an
billions of galaxies.
large universe.
Right,
yeah.
right. So if that's the only data point you've got, I can see why that it feels that way. But like we've been talking about over the last 6 weeks, there are a lot of other data points that make us believe that, yeah, there's good evidence that, in fact, there is a God, and in fact, that God has revealed himself in a way that we can know him. And, you know, if you take that into account, then I think it does make not only a lot of sense, but then to realize that, okay, well, if there is a God, isn't it weird to think that we would be more personal, like whoever or whatever created us is impersonal and yet created personal beings? That doesn't even make sense, right? Because even as we look at the chain of animal life, to be more personal is a higher state of being, right? Mm-hmm. So why would we think that we would supersede whatever or whoever created us? I think it makes a lot more sense to say, no, we were created personal for a reason. And what, you know, what God claims to reveal is that we were created for a relationship with him and with each other, and that's exactly why that's what's most important to us, and it drives us crazy when it's not right.
So why not make himself more obvious? I mean, if he wants this personal relationship with us and to be known by us, why not make him easier to be known? I mean, more obvious and speak directly to people, I mean, with words.
You know, that was one of the biggest questions that I wrestled with when I was in my conversion process, because faith did not come naturally to me. I mean, I don't remember believing in anything supernatural, even as a child. And so that was a very difficult question for me. Like, God, why are you making this so hard? I mean, you're God. You can solve this right now. You can appear to me and just get this taken care of. And what I realized is, you know, God is love. And in order for love to be real, in order for it to be authentic and to be true, it has to be chosen. But if God were to present himself to us individually, each one of us, we would have no choice but to love him, you know, seeing him in his full glory. And I realized God isn't invisible, he's ignorable. He lets himself be sort of camouflaged in the world so that he is there. He's all around us. I think, you know, we can feel him in this room. We feel him in our connections with people. He's there everywhere if you are looking for him. But he also makes himself ignorable so that if we want to ignore him, we can. We have that choice.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I used to think God was playing hard to get, you know, kind of like my wife, you know, when we were dating and even since. But there's just this sense, though, that I've realized, and I like what you were saying there, that it really has more to do with your position of your heart and what are you looking for. Mm-hmm. And what I've discovered is that he's not playing hard to get. It's been me that's been playing games along the way, that I've made choices and ignored God along the way. But when I have eyes to see, I remember when I was in college, I wanted to see something miraculous, so I started trying to write down anytime I saw something that was kind of beyond the ordinary or proof that God was involved in my life. And I had to quit after about 2 days because I felt like I was sitting there writing all day, every day. It was just everywhere. I suddenly could see things that I hadn't noticed before then.
So it's a choice of whether you want to open your eyes to see it or not.
I think so, and sometimes even a desire. You know, maybe you can't just say, okay, I want to start seeing God all around me, but even asking God, give me eyes to see. There was this moment where Jesus was walking along, and this man came up and said, God, you know, Jesus, I believe you can heal my son. Would you please help me? And he said, well, if you believe, I will heal him. And he says, well, I do believe, but help me with my unbelief. Mm-hmm. And I love his honesty in that moment. And I think that's a good prayer for us to pray, that for some of us who have been watching this over the last several weeks, maybe you're wanting enough proof so you can believe. And maybe just starting with that kind of prayer, God, help me with my unbelief. Help me to see what I'm missing along the way.
I want to talk more about prayer here in a moment, but Jennifer, I want to ask you, because you were an atheist for years, you were raised an atheist home. What was sort of that turning point for you that made you consider the possibility of God, much less a personal God?
Okay, interestingly, there was an intellectual turning point, and then there was a turning of the heart, which, you know, as you were saying, that's really where it is. The intellectual turning point was simply that I developed all these stereotypes about Christians, because isn't that how it is when we have a viewpoint that is not true, but we want to cling to, we protect ourselves with those stereotypes. So I had these stereotypes that atheism is for the intelligentsia, and Christianity is just, it was very much a Richard Dawkins view. Like, Christianity is nothing but silliness, and it's just absolutely false. And then I met this very interesting guy, who is now my husband, who had this amazing story. He was raised by a single mother, grew up in poverty, and he ended up going to Yale undergrad, Columbia Law School, and Stanford Business School, got most of the work done towards a master's in computer science while he was at Stanford. So no one could say that he wasn't a sharp guy. And after we were dating, it came out that he considered himself to be a Christian. And then, we would go meet all these people with degrees in fields that I can't even pronounce who were also Christians. And so for me, that was the first turning point for me, that more than anything, I let go of those silly stereotypes, that I realized that I had been embarrassing myself, frankly, by saying that, atheism is for smart people and Christianity is for dumb people. Then I started to think like, well, yeah, St. Augustine and Aquinas and, all these great, Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, all these amazing thinkers throughout the ages. I thought, really? Like, most of the founders of modern science, they were Christians. It made me realize how foolish that is. So that was my first turning point and my intellectual turning point.
And then I read on your blog that when you had your children, that was also your first child. That was also sort of a moment for you that sort of opened the door of exploring the possibility.
Yes. Well, that's what Eric was talking about. I think, you were making the point that our hearts really have to be in the right place. And it was when I had my son, it was interesting that my atheist upbringing worked against me at that moment, because I'd always been raised to be honest about the implications of what you believe. And so I looked at this child and I said, look at this beautiful, randomly evolved set of chemical reactions. And I thought, like, no, that's not right. And then the other thing is, in the atheist worldview, one of the ways that we determined value, and I think that you were speaking to this earlier, is that what makes us more valuable than, let's say a gnat. I mean, the Christian would say this, the soul, the higher element of being, but for atheists, we would say, well, cognitive ability. A gnat can't, do math and watch TV, so I guess I'm more valuable than a gnat. But then I looked at my son and I realized, he can't do that much. He's just a newborn. And there was actually an atheist professor at the time who said that it would be more acceptable to kill a newborn child than a pig, because pigs are more cognitively complex. And I realized I can't argue with that. From my own worldview, I cannot defend my infant son against this view. And it wasn't that, and atheists hear me say that and they say, so you wanted that to be false, and maybe a part of me did, but just intellectually I said, this is false. This is ridiculous. Like, it was just this moment of like, I know that the love that is in my family and that I feel for my son, it is coming from something outside of us. If a meteor struck the earth right now and we were all gone, that love would still be there. And so I thought, I'm going to go looking for the source of that.
So you started that process of searching, and where did you start?
I started by reading, because I'm a huge nerd. Well, I guess I did try to say a prayer, but it was so awkward. I literally said, like, is this thing on? I mean, like, how do you know? I was so not familiar with this that I was like...
Which honestly, I think probably is God's preferred prayer.
Yeah,
it's like, hey, dude, are you there or
right.
not?
I mean, I was being honest,
Yeah,
at least, right?
I think honesty is probably the best way to go.
Right, and so I said, like, how do you distinguish talking to God from talking to yourself? It was a mess. It was an absolute mess.
Yeah.
And nothing happened. And see, that's something that I didn't know, is that, seek and ye shall find. That is true, but we don't get a timetable there. I thought seek and you shall find means like I seek and then boom, here he
On
is,
my timetable.
like chorus of angels, And it was actually 7.
No chorus of angels?
Right, no, I heard like the air conditioner click on, like a siren in the distance. And so I thought like, well, so God doesn't exist, moving on. And 7 months passed, and in that 7 months, just nothing happened. And I like to tell people about that, because that I did not have the chorus of angels experience. And we were talking about Lee Strobel earlier. I actually came across his book, The Case for Christ, and I came across it in a very strange way that like I just randomly ended up finding it. Looking back, it was so obviously the Holy Spirit. And I was not immediately convinced, but it made people often ask, why did I start with Christianity? I had looked at other religions, but he made the point, my husband had made the point, if you're going to explore religion, you might want to go ahead and start with the only lasting world belief system whose founder claimed to be God. So, I thought, well, that's actually a really good point. So that really began the next step for me.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk more about why you landed on Christianity and Jesus. But first, I want to just kind of ask, going back to the idea, for those people who are still struggling with the idea of, okay, if God can be known personally, why not? Why is it any more obvious? It does seem, though, that the physical evidence that we have in modern day, I mean, you could say biblically he did reveal himself, through Jesus. But in modern day, the evidence we see for God, it seems to be more in line with a deist viewpoint of this God that sort of set things in motion and then hands off.
Well, it just depends on what evidence you're willing to admit, right? Because, I mean, we could line up millions of people who would give testimony, who would say, well, this is what I've seen God do in my life. And many would claim miraculous things. But if we're going to say, well, yours doesn't count because you said the M word, well, then, okay, you don't get any evidence. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, I think that often happens where, yeah, there are, and I wouldn't say, like I haven't seen miraculous things happen, phenomenal healings or things like that. And I haven't heard any audible voices, but I have definitely seen God guide me in a very personal way. And I too, like Jennifer, had to learn how. I had to understand it, because I had a time too after coming to faith. Even I remember one day, it was probably 8 or 9 months in, and I remember specifically I'd been running the track, and I was just walking, and I was sitting there just thinking, when I pray, am I just like talking to the air? Because I'm not getting anything. And I sat there wrestling with it, like maybe this is a joke. Maybe this is not real, and am I just fooling myself? And I kept wrestling with it, and I came to this thought, and I don't know why, but I think in a similar way that I think it was the thought from God. I think it might have been my first, was, well, maybe it's like any other relationship. It takes time. Like it takes time to get to know people. It takes time to develop understanding, and so I decided to give it time. And sure enough, I mean, like I have for 25 years now, written down, prayers, things I'm talking to God about, things I'm asking for, and where I've seen him come through, where I've seen, like when you step out in faith, trusting him, and
You've
don't
seen specific prayers answered.
Oh, yeah, I've got literally, I mean,
Lists.
thousands of pages of it over 25 years. Now, people could say, well, maybe you're making it all up in your head. Well, I mean, maybe I am, but I'll tell you, there are a lot of coincidences then that are eerie in the way they align with what God says is true about him. And when I seem to trust, and then I see him come through or something happens, I mean, for me, it's very personal.
I would think, too, as pastors, John and Eric, that you've seen a lot of people who have endured really difficult tragedies or come out of really difficult situations in life that would say it would not have been possible without their faith, without knowing God personally.
Absolutely. I mean, even this spring, tragically, I was at 2 funerals for babies. One that didn't make it to term, was stillborn. The other was a 2-year-old that drowned. And to watch the mom and the dad in both these situations navigate through the pain, the anger, the hurt, and somehow out of that talk about how much closer they felt to others and to God, and to certainly still be angry that God would allow something like that to happen, but to also somehow have hope. It really is amazing. And that's where even the deist view and when Dawkins or others talks about, it's delusional. I mean, it's so much broader beyond just America. Like, there are people around the world that when things are wrong, reach out to God, a God they may not have been raised to know about, but there is a sense inside of us, we need help. And so to see people come through those painful times, it is pretty remarkable.
Well, Jesse Ventura, remember his famous quote that religion is a crutch. Is it possible, though, that in those difficult situations, people use the idea of God and religion and a personal relationship as almost a coping mechanism to get through situations like that, a crutch to help them through those difficult situations?
I guess it could be.
Yeah, sure.
Well, yeah, I think it's like, I really rely on the law of gravity to keep me on this couch, and that's very comforting to me to know that I won't be floating up in the air, but it's true too. So I've never found that argument that compelling, because it's a real thing. I mean, God's power in our life, like you were saying, I mean, that these people could not get through these kinds of tragedies and still have a sense of joy in their lives without something real. And so call it a crutch if you want, but there's something real there.
You need the crutch of gravity?
Right.
I don't need that.
I've never heard of that one.
Well, the other thing I think about with the whole crutch thing is, I mean, implied in it is that I don't need anybody or anything. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, we're human. We're finite. We don't know everything. Like I've said before, we don't control much of our circumstances, where we're born, how or when we're going to die, what other people do that might affect us, our own emotions. I mean, we don't often even have control over our own emotions. And so to say, but I rely on nothing and no one, I need no crutch, it seems to me like that's not honesty.
Reality.
It's not really being honest.
I have a friend from East Africa, a new friend I met this summer, and he said that now that he's lived in the United States these last seven or 8 years, he's found that this is a much more difficult place for people to find God, because we have so much. And whereas he's from this place where he grew up in the tribal areas where he had to carry the water, and what we feel sorry for, he misses. And wishes, for his kids to have the kind of environment that he had, whereas in the United States, we're so arrogant, and we just think we have it all together, but we don't realize we have a limp. And there's something, I don't know, I think inside of us even, that we like to see people who admit their mistakes and admit they need help. We're drawn towards humility, and pride repels us, and I do think that sometimes if we're not careful, we'll as Americans, even come across that way.
So let me ask you this. If God is a personal God, to what extent does he care about the details of our life? I mean, there's wars and genocide going on. Does he care that your car broke down or that you're having a really bad day? I mean, how personal is personal?
I think in a way it underestimates God to say that he wouldn't care, like my favorite brand of lipstick, they recently took it. My favorite color, they took it off. They stopped selling it, and I caught myself saying a prayer like, "Oh Lord," and I thought, "Oh no, I am not. Oh come on," read the news headlines. And then I thought, certainly I think we are mistaken if we think that that's significant and it matters in the grand scheme of things. But I think, God doesn't get overwhelmed like we do. I think he's not like, "Look, man, I'm busy. There's a war. Like, I can't worry about your lipstick." That's not, he's
a better
infinite.
multitasker
Yeah,
than we
you're
are.
right. His capacity for love is infinite. And so I think he's saying, my child, if you can't find the shoelaces to your new pair of shoes, like I do care about that because I love you. I think it's just important to remember it's not necessarily important in the grand scheme of things, but God is infinite, and I think that he does. I think he does care in a certain way, but I'll leave it to the pastors to weigh in on that.
Any pastor want to weigh in?
I think that's a great answer, and I think many times when people say things like that, like I mean, how could God care about the little details of my life when there's such big, huge problems going on? I mean, that assumes like the whole thing's gotten out of his control, so he's got to be busying himself with bigger things. And I don't think that's at all who God is or what he's about. Hugh Ross says something really interesting about if God exists. Hugh Ross is an astrophysicist. He says, if God exists in even 2 dimensions of time, okay, so we exist in 1 dimension of time. It's linear, right? We go from this moment to that moment to that moment. But if God exists in even 2 dimensions of time, then he has infinite time to pay attention to our every prayer at every moment of our 1 dimension of time. You know, and of course, if he has 3 dimensions of time, it's like all those go to one point at which he experiences every point of time simultaneously, which I think is what Jesus said. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end.
Right.
So I think many times when we get caught up in those kinds of things, we're thinking finite. You know, we're thinking from our perspective. Yeah.
I like that phrase, thinking finite. That's good.
Well, and you talk about the ability of God to sort of handle and manage everything, and he's sovereign over all. And if this is the case, and yet he is still personal, I think a lot of people struggle with the idea of, okay, if he can control everything and manage everything, and he cares about everything going on in my life, how do you explain things like natural disasters, hurricanes and tornadoes? Where is the loving personal God in those tragedies?
Well, and I think, you know, when you think not just the natural disasters, but all the suffering and injustice, because look, it's not a just world. People get away with tons of junk and seemingly are never held accountable for it. I think it does show the fact that God allows it. I think shows that there is a reason for it, and his reason is that there actually is something very much better, and there is something very much worse. So the reason for pain is to be a warning. That's what pain does. It serves as a warning. And if God allows a certain amount of pain and suffering, maybe it's a warning. And if God allows a certain amount of beauty and love and joy, it's to signal something too. And so I do think that's the purpose of it. I mean, C.S. Lewis said pain is God's megaphone to rouse a sleeping, deaf world.
Go ahead.
Oh, I would just add, you know, one of the things that someone once pointed out to me that helped me a lot was, he said, you know, let's start with the worst tragedy that ever happened was we murdered God. He came here to bless us and to save us, and we crucified him. That's the worst thing that's ever happened. But look what God did with it. And he said, you know, that, and this is someone who had experienced great tragedy, and he said, you know, God will bring good out of everything, and he doesn't micromanage the world. We all have free will, and events are allowed to play out, and it's not exactly that he wills evil. He allows evil to work, but in every single case, he will bring a good out of it, just like he did with the resurrection.
I think a lot of people struggle who are going through tragedy. They struggle with that answer from Christians. Well, God will bring good out of it. God will bring something good out of it.
Well, I think when it's a triteism and a platitude kind of feel, it is. I mean, I remember when my dad, you know, died, and I mean, at that moment, that's not just, you don't want to hear that, like, because it's kind of like trying to paste over and make you feel better, and it just doesn't. You got to grieve. But at the same time, in a bigger perspective, like, tragedy happens. I mean, whether there's a God or not, we suffer. So the bigger tragedy is if you suffer for nothing, and there's never any redemption of it. There's never anything good that's going to come out of it. It's just a crappy world. Did I just say that? Yeah, I did. Okay. It's just a crappy world, and, you know, then you die, right? And but that doesn't really make sense to the way we deal with pain and suffering. Because we deal with pain and suffering as if something's wrong. But if there is no God, there's nothing wrong. This is the way it's always been. This is human evolution. Suck it up.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you know, that's the thing. And so I think even our resistance to pain and suffering tells us something.
All right, we have a question from a viewer submitted social media. They want to know, I hear about people experiencing God. What does experiencing God look like? How do you do that? Anybody want to take that one?
Well, there's certain times where God, makes himself known through a conversation that just happened at the exact moment I needed it. Or other times I've interacted, this goes back to the question on tragedies that we face. I've interacted with a woman who was violated. She was raped, and now she sees her purpose as helping others who've been through that horrific experience find healing. And so to see and experience God takes on many different forms and many different ways. Sometimes it might be reading the Bible and reading the exact verse that I needed in that moment to help me with someone who I'm struggling with. And so experiencing God is like what John said earlier. It's very much a relationship. I feel like sometimes I have, private jokes with God, funny things that happen that only he would know mean something to me, or secret missions from God, There's this relationship with God is not very different than, and if not better and even closer than what we can have with our earthly father or with a spouse. Like those are even analogies that we see in the scriptures, that God can be as a parent to a child and as a spouse, a husband to a wife.
I think that's why faith is so important. It says in Scripture, without faith, it's impossible to please God. And that's because really faith is just a synonym for trust. Faith or belief. But really, I like to think about it more like trust. And there is no relationship without trust. Look at a marriage relationship. If there's not trust, you don't have a relationship. Mm-hmm. And so I think developing a relationship with God operates on the same premise. You get to know, you seek to know. So like with my wife, when we were dating to decide whether we were going to marry, we had to spend time getting to know each other, right? And so do you seek to know God? And he's claimed he's revealed a lot about his character, his will, and himself in a very personal way through Jesus. And so as you get to know him, then you've got to decide, am I going to trust him? And that's a different deal. And that's more of a heart. Mm-hmm. That's more of a heart deal, right? Where you decide, okay, well, he said this about worry. He said, don't worry, Don't worry about all these things that everybody else worries about. All right, well, what would that look like to actually trust him next time I'm worrying, and see what happens? Or, any number of things, or lots of things.
So someone who's wanting to initiate the process of getting to know God personally, and particularly for someone like you, Jennifer, who that was a foreign concept for, what is that first step? What's the first step in starting that process?
I think the first step is humility. And what I mean by that, it's a misunderstood concept. I think some people think humility means having low self-esteem. Humility means, just realizing that you're not God, and, just kind of understanding your place in the grand scheme of things, and that, you're not king or queen of the world. Because, a lot of the great Christian thinkers have written about the danger of pride, and that's something that I really saw in my conversion, and maybe this is different for people of different temperaments, but for me, my pride was a huge block because I was so worried of looking foolish. None of my friends had faith. We were all either atheist, agnostic. It's Austin, maybe a couple Wiccans, but nobody was Christian. And I was so worried about, what if I look like a fool? What if I think that I experienced something, but it's all in my head? And so for me, the first step was to say, I'm willing to look like a fool if that's what it takes to do this right. I'm willing to lay down my pride and take that risk. And like you've both said, there's a direct analogy there to falling in love with a person. It's, it just like it wouldn't work if you approached a girlfriend, saying do you love me? Do you love me? Prove that you love me. I want to be guarded. I don't want to put my heart out there. You're never going to have a loving relationship. The first step to any relationship, including your relationship with God, is a vulnerability and a real sense of humility.
So, Jennifer, when you started that process, your pursuit led you to Jesus. How did you end up there? What convinced you that was the way to know God personally?
Like I was saying earlier, it was that idea that, there's only, and you'll see when I talk, it was very kind of in my head. I mean, because that was my background. This idea that, people throughout the ages have tried to claim to be God. It's a great way to start your little cult, get a bunch of people to follow you or give you money. But then when you do the very ungodlike move of dying and staying dead, that religion doesn't tend to last. And so I thought that was very interesting that this guy made these outrageous claims, but his religion is still around today. Millions and billions of people follow it. And then I thought, and this was actually something that Lee Strobel first pointed out, this idea was something crazy happened in first century Palestine. I mean, you can't deny it. And this was a religion that there was no benefit to joining it. I mean, it's like, hey, be a Christian.
Well, martyrdom.
That's the benefit. Yeah, like quite a sales pitch. Like, hello, would you like to
love
be a Christian?
others and get killed?
Right, like, yeah, come die with me. I mean, and so I was just racking my brain, like, I got my degree in advertising. I felt like I know human nature pretty well. I was trained to know human nature. I cannot explain why this religion, whose benefit was like, you get to be poor and die, spread like wildfire throughout the ancient world. And there are a few other things like that, but it made me think, okay, something happened in first century Palestine. And the more I read, and I began reading the New Testament and making my very lame efforts at praying, I began to see there is something to this Jesus guy. I mean, he's the only one. I mean, who else would help me know God? If I look at all through history, I mean, he's the one. And so I won't say that it was really powerful emotionally at first, but it was like, I need to keep checking out this Jesus guy.
Well, I think that is an amazing story. And really, there's an actual book in the Bible, in the New Testament, written by Jesus' best friend, John, the Gospel of John. And he even writes, I'm writing this so that you might believe. And so that's a great place to jump in. And just like Jennifer was saying, just to pray with humility. Okay, God, if you're real, show me who you are. And just as you read through the Gospel of John, notice how Jesus treated people. Notice how people reacted to Jesus. And really just explore God by reading through the Gospel of John. It's literally written for those of us who are wanting to believe but don't know necessarily how. And it's looking at the life of Jesus from the eyes of his best friend.
So I think a lot of people can maybe accept the idea that Jesus is a way, but a lot of people struggle with the idea that he is the only way to a personal relationship with God. How do you account for people from other religions who feel like they've personally experienced God, but not through Jesus, through another path? How do you account for their experience? What are they experiencing if it's not the personal God? John?
Well, I don't know, because I don't know who you're talking about or what their experience was.
But do you think people of other religions who claim that they've experienced God personally, you're dismissing their experience?
In the New Testament, Jesus really upset the religious people of his day, because he points out that God actually is at work in people other than the Jewish people who thought, no, we got the lock on God. So, he makes some statements like that, that no, God sent Elijah way over here to this person who wasn't of you guys. And, and Paul says the same thing in Acts chapter 14. He goes into Lystra, this pagan, idol-worshiping city, and he says, God hasn't left himself without testimony here. He's the one who's been putting joy in your hearts. He's been giving you good gifts like rain for your crops. And so he's acknowledging. So the Christian faith acknowledges that, hey, God is at work everywhere. It's not like he's not there, like we got to bring him to people. No, he's already there. The question is just whether people are responding. Now, I do think what he's uniquely done through Jesus is make himself known in a way we can really understand. And he does want us to know him in a more personal way. And he also wants us to know the central question that we have to answer if we're really going to let God be God of our lives. And I think that is am I condemned? Because I think if we're all honest, we all know we've done things that are wrong. I mean, even if we just want to define it by our own sense of right and wrong, we've still done things that are wrong, right? You know? And so what do you do with that? And I think deep inside, and this was my case before I became a Christian, is that, you know, I just kind of decided, well, if God's going to judge me and condemn me, then to hell with it. I'm going to have a hell of a good time in the meantime.
On the way out.
I mean, really, that was my attitude. It was stupid and arrogant, but it was my attitude. And I think a lot of people kind of think that way, like they know something's wrong. So I think what's so significant about what God did through Jesus is he made a way for us to know we don't need to run and hide from God, even though we have done wrong, even though we've turned away from him. Like Jennifer said, he's created a world where we truly have free will. And I think I think it's because of what he's creating. I think he's trying to create us, eternally free people who will eternally choose to love him. And so he does give us free will. And we've all turned away. And so through Jesus, I think he gives us a chance to know that he's not going to hold that against us if we will turn back to him and trust him and love him.
All right, well, as pastors, I'm sure you probably get this question a lot, but if Jesus is the only way, what about the people in the world who have never heard of Jesus? They don't know he's the way to a personal relationship with God. I mean, they're just out of luck.
Well, Romans 2 says that you're judged if you have the law according to the law, but if you don't have the law, you're not judged according to the law. In other words, God is more merciful and kinder than any of us could be. You know, even as you look, and I've had a chance to travel to different places around the world, I've met people who would say, you know, they're not a good Muslim, or they're not a good Christian, or they're not really following what it means to be Jewish. And so a lot of times I see a lot more people who have tried to use religion to get to God and feel like they're not making it. And so again, whether that world religion is Christianity or Islam or Judaism or something else, there's a sense of this is different than that. Religion is our attempts to get to God, but Jesus came to us. We don't have to get to him. He's already come here. And so I believe that there are people around the world that may not know the name of Jesus, but they're calling out to a God to save them. And so God is more merciful than we are. We can trust the God who knows the answer to that question. Even in the book of Jonah, you know, Jonah was this suicidal missionary. He'd rather die than see the people of Nineveh follow after God. And the reason he didn't want to go to Nineveh was he knew and even prayed an angry prayer. God, I knew you are a gracious and compassionate God. That's why I didn't want to go there.
Well, and Nineveh, what were their sworn enemies?
Yeah, they were evil people.
And according to the Jewish people, wicked, evil people. And God wanted him to go to them and to tell them about him. And he didn't want to because he knew God was merciful.
Yeah.
And sure enough, that's what happened, is the Ninevites turned back to God, and he was like, crud, I knew you were going to do this.
Right.
Well, we've got a question kind of on this topic from social media. One of our viewers writes, does God actually want a relationship with everyone? Is that his desire, to have a relationship with everyone?
It even says that, in the scriptures.
That's what I think, that's why he created us. You know, God, think about it, you know, he is amazingly creative. I mean, he didn't have to create a million species or things like the platypus. You know, he's humorous too, obviously. Mm-hmm. And why every single human with a unique fingerprint? Well, I think it's because he created us unique for a reason. And the relationship that you can have with God is actually different than the relationship I can have. And it was intended to be that way.
All right, we've got a question from Kurt who asks, it seems impossible to know somebody or have a personal relationship with someone who won't talk to you at all, who won't talk with you coherently, and who won't answer your really tough questions. Who wants to take that one?
I dated a girl like that once.
He's awesome. That's a good question.
Well, I think
sometimes marriage feels that way too, doesn't it?
Right. Well, I do think that, you know, again, I heard somebody once say that communication is 70% nonverbal. And so that's how humans interact. We interact and understand in nonverbal ways. And so That's been my experience with God too, that he does speak. And many times it's well, I've never heard that audible voice, but I'm telling you, there have been moments where I needed God to speak to me, and someone I happened to be having lunch with started talking about a situation just like what I was facing. Or I remember one time my neighbor backed his car into my house, and when we lived in Los Angeles, and I had to go over and ask him to fix that, and he said he'd send his cousin who was a plumber. Well, I took that as fine, and my wife said, that's ridiculous. There's a crack in our kid's bedroom. We live in Los Angeles. It could kill our kids if there's an earthquake. I didn't know what to do. I'd already agreed, and the next day I wake up trying to figure out what am I going to do, and I read Proverbs 6. It says, if you make an agreement with your neighbor and you wish you hadn't, go to him and ask for forgiveness and ask to get out of your agreement. And I thought, okay, then that's God speaking to me. And so I went over and told him, I can't have your plumber cousin fix my house. I need someone else to do it. And so there have just been amazing moments like that in my life where if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, God is speaking and communicating in clearer ways than I think sometimes we do even as people.
Yeah, I think I wrote a book about this, because it was a mystery to me. And I, looking back, I realized it actually did take learning to hear. And throughout the Old Testament, the Old Testament prophets and Jesus many times say this phrase that Eric said before, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. And I don't think it's that they didn't have these things back then. He's talking about a spiritual kind of listening, a spiritual kind of hearing. I think one of the things that we misunderstand is we tend to think that verbal communication is the most direct, right? But like what I'm actually trying to do right now is get my thoughts into your heads, right? But I'm having to use, my voice, which is hoarse, and your ears, and, your canals, which may have wax in them, who knows, and then get my thoughts into your head, and you can still be thinking about something else. It'd be much more direct if I could just put all my thoughts directly in your thoughts. And then you would fully understand what I'm thinking. You could still say, oh, that's a stupid thought, and push it away. Or you could think, I want to think about something else, and ignore it completely. Or you could really consider it. So that would be a more direct way of actually helping you understand all my thoughts. I can't do that, but I think God actually can. So I think he puts his thoughts directly in our thoughts, and having spiritual ears to hear is learning how to listen for those thoughts. And when we act in faith on them, when we trust, and that's why I think it's important to know who God is and what his character is, because you can also get thoughts that are kooky and would lead you to do stupid, crazy, or
evil stuff.
Sure. Right. I mean, we know about people who do stuff in the name of God, and they got evil thoughts, right? So you do have to you do have to know his character and what he's revealed about himself. But I think as you learn to discern those promptings in your thoughts that align with what you know is true about God, and you act on them, what happens is you start to be able to look back and see, wow, look what happened as a result. And it's kind of like, was that just a coincidence, or
Right.
was that God?
So Jennifer, I'm just curious, when you started telling your atheist friends that you were communicating with God and speaking with him and conversing with him, how did that go over?
I didn't, because I was a coward. It actually didn't come up until Joe and I had been practicing for a while, and I didn't say like I've been communicating with God, because I know how how that would sound, and so the way I would phrase it would be I don't know, things more like talking about the scientists who were Christians or something, but when I have spoken to in more recent times, I've said something like I think God really inspired me to do that, and that's always a conversation stopper. And I think that what they hear me saying is like I'm literally hearing voices, and I think they probably suspect that I am kind of making up whatever I want, like I think God wants me to go to Hawaii for a week.
You've joined the 60% of the human race that are delusional.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think it's one of those things. Whenever we talk to non-believers, I think it's we need to watch our terminology. It's like anything. We have our own jargon. We have our own lingo, and I even use it more now. But I remember being on the outside looking in, and just, people would say something like, God really spoke to my heart. And I was like, what on earth? Like,
Yeah.
shouldn't he speak to your ear? Like, I mean, I was extremely literal. And so I do try to keep that in mind, that I need to phrase things in a way that will be accessible to them.
That's why I often say I sensed a prompting as opposed to God spoke to me. Because that kind of bugs me too when Christians do that. Like, God told me. Like, are you sure?
Well,
Because that's a point. You're not always
yes,
sure
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
until you act. I mean, that's the thing that I've seen over and over again, is it is faith. It's trusting, and then you begin to see.
Well, exactly. There is a sense of, I think this is what God wants me to do, and then you act on it, and that's that prompting. There's a humility to say, this is what God told me, does come across, the wrong way. But to have a posture, I can tell the difference between my thoughts and God's thoughts, because God's thoughts are usually selfless. They usually require courage, and they're consistent with His character. And that starts to be the guide to know when to step forward, and when I think that is God speaking.
Well, the vast majority of Americans agree with you. They seem to think that God does answer prayer. In fact, 83% of Americans say that God answers prayer, according to a USA Today Gallup poll. But it does seem that Americans live in a very prosperous, wealthy nation. We're in a secure nation. Does it stand to reason that, Americans would think God answers prayer? Things are going pretty well for most Americans. But when you look at some of these underdeveloped countries where there are these ridiculously high mortality rates and people are starving, God just doesn't answer their prayers? I mean, does He play favorites? How do you reconcile that?
They have more faith than we do, typically. A friend of ours, I'm so blessed to know her, she grew up in a level of poverty in rural Mexico that we can't even fathom. I mean, they had her father, they had 8 children, and her father was murdered when she was a young child, which left her mother just alone in the world. They had a roof that was made out of leaves, and it would leak. And she and her family, and I didn't know her mother, but I knew her siblings, and she told me of her mother. They were the most faith-filled people, and she is to this day. I mean, she's one of those people, it's like you can feel the Holy Spirit when you're around her. She's so amazing. One time she told me a story. She said, I guess shortly after her father's murder, the children didn't have blankets. They certainly didn't have pillows, but it was getting cool. They all slept on the floor, and there were no blankets. And she said her mother prayed about that, and a man who owned a bar was recovering his pool tables, gave them the felt to use as blankets, and her mother was so thankful for the answered prayer. And I said, wouldn't like a down comforter have been better? Yeah, I mean, she was grateful for that, and she said, the prayer was that she knew He was there. Her mother accepted, there's suffering in this world. It's a fallen world. Everything's terrible. But the Lord let me know that He was there. And I think that that's what people in developing countries understand that we don't. God's not an ATM machine, but He does let us know, that He's there.
When I've visited lesser developed countries and talked with people there who are Christians, they do seem to, despite the physical needs that they don't have met, they do seem to have this extraordinary faith that I think we lack in this country.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my experience. I mean, I've traveled around the world, and I've lived, in impoverished situations. And, after all that, my conclusion is that we're not actually that blessed, which always takes people back. But, Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed, I mean, all the opposites of what we would think. And I think He was right. I mean, the more I've experienced people who have this incredible wealth of
stuff.
We have an incredible wealth of stuff, but many times we're arrogant about it, and we're blinded by it. And I mean, think of what craziness it is that we are. If you make more than $1,800 a year, you're in the top 20% of the world's wealthiest. Okay, if you make $47,000 a year more, You're in the top 1% of the world's wealthiest, okay? But if you interview people with $47,000 a year or more in income and ask them, how much more do you need to be happy? They'll say 23% more. Across the boards, even if they're making $5 million a year. And we are the most indebted civilization ever because no matter how much we make, we have to have more than we can afford. It seems to me like there's something very broken in that. And I think that's something that we're just blind to. We don't see that there are spiritual needs within us that we keep trying to placate with material goods or power or sex, and it doesn't do it. And yet it blinds us to what God really wants to give us. That doesn't come from the outside in, it comes from the inside out.
Let's talk a little bit more about the idea of God answering and not answering prayers. It does seem that when prayers are answered, they talk about how good God is and he answers those prayers. And when they don't get the prayers answered the way they want, they chalk it up as, well, it wasn't God's will. Is that kind of a cop-out, or is it,
It's confusing. I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, I don't understand why or when God answers some prayers and doesn't answer others, and Eric understands all that.
So Eric, explain that to us.
Well, I do think there is a sense of we really don't know. And that's ultimately where trust and faith do come in. That I don't know all the answers, but I know the one who does. And I know he loves me, and I know he loves those who are wondering if they're loved. That he's more accessible than we would ever imagine if we would just look. I love that camouflage idea.
He's ignorable.
He is ignorable, but he's not invisible. He wants to know us even more than we want to know him. And just having eyes to see and a desire and asking God for help in that. Whatever our prayers might be. He can
I always go back to, there's a passage in Romans 8 that says, if God is for us, who can be against us? And, if he didn't hold back his own son, why would he hold back any good thing from us? And, when things don't go my way, which that's when prayers aren't answered, that means they didn't go my way, right? And that's where I've got to default back to, it's pretty easy for us to realize if you've raised little kids, that if you gave your little kids everything they wanted, they would destroy themselves because they don't have a bigger picture of life and how it works and what's best for them. And I don't think it's too big of a stretch to think, well, maybe God, if there is one, knows more than we do, then maybe I need to trust him like I would want my little kids to trust me in some of those areas where he says no or wait. Yeah.
And is it possible that we just see, this much
That's
of
right.
the bigger picture?
That's right.
We've got a question, a Twitter question from David. He asks, how about the fact that God sends people to hell, mad hell, made the rules and sends them there? There's a doozy. How does a loving, personal God send people to hell?
Well, I personally go with what C.S. Lewis said about that. C.S. Lewis was an Oxford professor who was an atheist who came to faith. And he said, God doesn't send anybody to hell, they send themselves there. And what he meant by that is that God will take anyone who's willing. But God truly has created us free. And free meaning we are free even to reject God as God. So we truly can say, no, I don't want you to be the ruler of the universe or my life or anything else. I want to be that. And in the end, if that's true, what do we want God to do? See, when we say, well, isn't that just horrible? He created us this way, he made the rules, and then he's going to send us to hell. But that makes a lot of assumptions. Like, how does God create free will people who will forever freely choose to love him? And if we're really free, then what does he do with a Hitler? Assuming Hitler, never wanted God to be God. He wanted to play God of not only his life, but millions of others' lives, right? So does God take him to heaven and make him live there with God as God? Which means Hitler would be in prison because he doesn't want God to be God. But what would prison in heaven be? except hell, right? The scriptures say hell was not created for humans, but for angels. That God actually created other beings besides us, and that angels are eternal creatures. And those that made an eternal choice in the presence of God, where do you go where God is not? Where there is no love, no joy, God doesn't rule. Well, he created a place like that, where those who truly don't want God can have it their way. But it's not a party, it's not what a lot of rock bands think.
But if God is all loving, why even create us with this capacity for such sin and death? And on that note,
I think I'm talking too much. I think the capacity for evil is exactly the opposite of the capacity to love. So a dog can love me a lot more than a hamster, right? Has a greater capacity. But a dog actually has greater capacity to turn on me and bite me and hurt me than a hamster, right? And a dog, though, is not going to be treacherous or betray you, probably, or lie behind your back or deceive you. It doesn't have that capacity. And in the same way, you're usually not completely satisfied with the love of a dog. You want the love of a human. Why? Well, because they have a greater capacity to love. But with that, they have a greater capacity to do just the opposite. So I think that's why. All the evil is the absence of what God intended. It's us turning from God and his ways and having it our way. And we don't like the consequences, but we don't see it for what it is. We blame God. But he's not actually the one to blame. He created the environment where we could choose.
well, on that note, we're out of time, but I thank all of you for joining us. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I hope our viewers have enjoyed it as well. Thanks for tuning in to the Explore God Online Q&A Forum. Check out our website for videos and articles on these spiritual topics and more, and have a good night. Thank you.